In the vast length of history, one dark thread weaves through centuries, binding the fates of millions: the transatlantic slave trade. This cruel chapter, spanning from the 15th to the 19th centuries, saw the forced migration of Africans to the Americas for labor. Rooted in the exploration and expansion of European powers during the Age of Discovery, this historical atrocity laid the groundwork for systemic enslavement, leaving an indelible mark on the collective conscience of humanity. It is also worthwhile for you to know the reason why we're making this video. It is because of the systemic erasure of black history and history in general out from African schools. There's this popular African saying: when you're ignorant of what killed your father, what killed your father will kill you. So, do us a huge favor to like, share, put your thoughts on this video in the comments section and subscribe to this channel, Black and Powerful. Don't forget to turn on the bell notification for future videos. Thanks for subscribing. Let's continue the video. As we unravel this painful history, we delve into the growth of the transatlantic slave trade, the harrowing process of enslavement, and the auction blocks where humanity itself was commodified. We confront the inhumane conditions aboard slave ships during the infamous Middle Passage, where lives were lost, and the survivors faced a new chapter of oppression upon reaching the Americas. Through forced separations, brutal labor exploitation, and the relentless march of dehumanization, we witness the resilience of those who endured. Historical context: the transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 15th to the 19th centuries, was a deeply entrenched system that involved the forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas for labor. The historical context is rooted in European exploration and expansion during the Age of Discovery, marked by the Portuguese exploration of the African coast in the 15th century. As European powers sought new trade routes and economic opportunities, the demand for cheap labor in the colonies grew, setting the stage for the systematic enslavement of African people. Growth of the transatlantic slave trade. The growth of the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by economic motives, with European powers establishing colonies in the Americas to exploit vast resources such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This economic boom created an insatiable demand for labor that local indigenous populations could not meet. As a result, European slavers turned to Africa as a major source of enslaved labor. Enslavement. The process of enslavement was multifaceted, beginning with the capture of Africans on the continent. Often facilitated by local African leaders or European traders, individuals were forcibly taken from their communities, enduring harrowing journeys to the coast where they were packed into slave ships. These ships, infamous for their brutal conditions, became known as the Middle Passage. Enslaved individuals faced dehumanizing conditions during the Middle Passage, including overcrowded and unsanitary quarters, limited food and water, and exposure to diseases. Mortality rates were alarmingly high, contributing to the loss of countless lives during the transatlantic journey. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved individuals were subjected to auction and sale, marking the beginning of a life defined by forced labor, exploitation, and the constant threat of physical and psychological abuse. The institution of slavery became deeply entrenched in the economic and social fabric of the Americas, leaving a lasting impact on the descendants of those who endured its horrors. Capture and transportation. The capture and transportation of individuals into slavery marked the grim initiation of their harrowing journey. This process often involved African intermediaries collaborating with European slave traders. Local conflicts, raids, or deception were employed to seize people from their communities, leading to the tragic separation of families and the disruption of established societies. The captives, commonly from diverse ethnic backgrounds, were then forced to endure the treacherous journey to the coast. Transportation to the coast involved grueling marches, often covering vast distances, with captives bound in chains and subjected to physical abuse. The horrific nature of this stage laid the groundwork for the trauma that would persist throughout the entire enslavement experience. Inhumane conditions on slave ships. The conditions aboard slave ships during the transatlantic voyage, known as the Middle Passage, were characterized by unspeakable cruelty and inhumanity. Packed tightly into the hulls of the ships, enslaved individuals faced extreme overcrowding, limited ventilation, and dismal sanitation conditions. These deplorable circumstances created an environment ripe for the spread of diseases, leading to devastating mortality rates. The Middle Passage was not only physically arduous but also psychologically tormenting. Enslaved people endured the stench of bodily fluids, suffering, and death, while being shackled for the majority of the journey. The lack of privacy and constant exposure to brutality intensified the trauma experienced by those forced into this horrific ordeal. Many did not survive the journey, succumbing to diseases, malnutrition, or the brutal treatment inflicted upon them. The survivors, however, were confronted with a new chapter of oppression as they arrived in the Americas to face auction, forced labor, and the enduring legacy of the dehumanizing experience aboard the slave ships. Understanding the depths of these inhumane conditions is crucial to appreciating the profound impact the transatlantic slave trade had on individuals and communities throughout history. Auctions and family separation. Auction processes. The auction processes during the era of slavery were pivotal moments that perpetuated the dehumanization of enslaved individuals. Upon arrival in the Americas, those who survived the treacherous journey were often herded into marketplaces or designated auction sites. Here, they became commodities to be bought and sold, stripped of their personal identities and reduced to mere property. Auctioneers, sometimes aided by medical examinations that further objectified individuals, would advertise the physical attributes and skills of the enslaved, emphasizing their labor potential. This degrading spectacle not only commodified human lives but also perpetuated racial stereotypes and contributed to the normalization of systemic racism. Enslaved people were frequently separated from friends, kin, and community members during auctions. Families, which held deep cultural and emotional significance, were torn apart as individuals were sold to different slaveholders. The callous disregard for these familial bonds added an additional layer of trauma to an already brutal existence. Forced separation of families. The forced separation of families was a deliberate tactic employed to break down social structures within enslaved communities. Slaveholders intentionally disrupted familial ties, as they recognized the strength and resilience that familial bonds could instill in resisting individuals. The heart-wrenching scenes of parents torn from children and spouses separated not only caused immediate anguish but also had enduring psychological consequences for generations. Children were particularly vulnerable to family separation, and their forced removal from parents often resulted in the loss of cultural heritage, language, and a sense of belonging. The emotional toll of family separation reverberated throughout the enslaved community, perpetuating a cycle of trauma that persisted even after the abolition of slavery. Understanding the auction processes and forced separation of families is crucial for recognizing the profound and lasting impact of slavery on individuals and communities. These practices dehumanized and fractured lives, leaving a legacy of intergenerational trauma that continues to shape societal dynamics today. Labor exploitation. Plantation work. Plantation work was a central aspect of the brutal system of slavery, particularly in the Americas during the 17th to 19th centuries. Enslaved individuals were forced to toil in large agricultural operations, predominantly cultivating cash crops like tobacco, sugar, cotton, and rice. Plantations, characterized by vast expanses of land, required an extensive and inexpensive labor force to maximize profits. Enslaved people endured grueling hours of labor under harsh conditions, working from sunrise to sunset in sweltering heat or inclement weather. The nature of plantation work often involved physically demanding tasks such as planting, harvesting, and processing crops. The oppressive workload contributed to the severe physical toll on the enslaved, leading to exhaustion, malnutrition, and various health issues. Brutal working conditions. The working conditions on plantations were characterized by cruelty and disregard for the well-being of the enslaved. Inadequate shelter, meager food rations, and lack of proper clothing compounded the physical toll of labor. Enslaved individuals often lived in overcrowded and unsanitary quarters, exacerbating the risk of diseases. The brutal nature of plantation work extended beyond the physical demands, as enslaved individuals were subjected to constant surveillance and harsh treatment by overseers. The dehumanizing conditions perpetuated a culture of fear, where any attempt to resist or express discontent could result in severe consequences. Punishments for disobedience. Punishments for disobedience or perceived insubordination were often brutal and served to further assert dominance and control. Enslaved individuals faced a range of punishments, including whipping, branding, mutilation, or even execution. These harsh penalties were intended to deter resistance and maintain a submissive workforce. The fear of punishment created a climate of compliance, suppressing any potential rebellion or defiance. The psychological impact of constant threat and violence further intensified the trauma experienced by those subjected to the dehumanizing conditions of plantation labor. Understanding the context of plantation work, brutal conditions, and punishments for disobedience provides insight into the pervasive exploitation and degradation inherent in the institution of slavery. It underscores the resilience and strength displayed by enslaved individuals in the face of systemic oppression. Physical and psychological abuse. Physical violence and torture. Physical violence and torture were pervasive tools used by slaveholders to assert control and dominance over enslaved individuals. Enslaved people were subjected to various forms of brutality, including whipping, beating, mutilation, and even sexual assault. These acts of violence served not only as punishment for perceived disobedience but also as a means to instill fear and prevent resistance. Whippings, in particular, were a common method of punishment on plantations, leaving lasting physical scars and emotional trauma. The dehumanizing nature of such abuse reinforced the notion of enslaved individuals as property rather than human beings, perpetuating a cycle of systemic violence. Psychological trauma. The psychological trauma inflicted on enslaved individuals was profound and enduring. Constant exposure to physical abuse, family separation, and the degrading conditions of slavery left deep emotional scars. The persistent threat of violence and the dehumanizing treatment reinforced a sense of powerlessness and inferiority, contributing to long-lasting mental health challenges. The trauma extended beyond individual experiences to affect entire communities. Fear, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability became ingrained in the collective psyche of enslaved people. This psychological impact has had intergenerational consequences, influencing the mental health and well-being of descendants of those who endured slavery. Restriction of education and culture. Slaveholders recognized the power of education and cultural preservation as tools of empowerment. As a result, enslaved individuals were systematically denied access to education and forbidden from practicing their cultural traditions and religions. This deliberate restriction aimed to control the narrative and prevent the transmission of knowledge and identity across generations. The denial of education reinforced the subjugation of enslaved people, limiting their ability to articulate their experiences, resist oppression, or advocate for their rights. The suppression of cultural practices contributed to the erasure of individual and collective identities, further dehumanizing the enslaved population. Understanding the context of physical and psychological abuse, along with the restriction of education and culture, is essential for comprehending the depth of the dehumanization experienced by enslaved individuals. It highlights the resilience required to endure such atrocities and emphasizes the ongoing impact of these historical injustices on present-day communities. Sexual exploitation. Forced relationships. Forced relationships were a distressing aspect of sexual exploitation during slavery, where enslaved individuals were often compelled into unions against their will. Slaveholders would dictate these relationships, disregarding the personal autonomy and desires of those involved. The goal was to increase the enslaved population for economic reasons, leading to the birth of more enslaved individuals who could be used for labor. This practice further exemplified the dehumanization inherent in the institution of slavery, reducing individuals to tools for economic gain. Exploitation of enslaved women. Enslaved women faced particularly egregious forms of sexual exploitation. They were vulnerable to sexual assault and exploitation by slaveholders and overseers. The power dynamics were imbalanced, with enslaved women having little to no agency over their own bodies. Sexual violence not only inflicted physical harm but also had profound psychological repercussions, perpetuating a culture of fear and trauma among enslaved women. Legal dehumanization. Slave codes and laws. Legal dehumanization was institutionalized through the implementation of slave codes and laws that explicitly denied basic human rights to enslaved individuals. These codes, enacted by colonial and later American governments, regulated the lives of the enslaved, reinforcing their status as property rather than people. Slave codes restricted movement, prohibited education, and severely limited any form of resistance. The legal framework provided slaveholders with the authority to exert control and maintain a system built on dehumanization. Lack of legal protection. Enslaved individuals were systematically denied legal protection, as laws were designed to uphold the institution of slavery rather than safeguard the rights of those subjected to its brutality. Courts often favored slaveholders, and the legal system failed to recognize the humanity of the enslaved. The absence of legal safeguards perpetuated an environment where exploitation, violence, and dehumanization could occur with impunity. Resistance and repercussions. Slave revolts. Despite the pervasive oppression, enslaved individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience through various forms of resistance, including slave revolts. These acts of rebellion sought to challenge the status quo and assert a desire for freedom. Notable revolts, such as Ned Turner's Rebellion and the Stono Rebellion, highlighted the unwavering spirit of resistance among the enslaved, even in the face of severe consequences. Punishments for resistance. Slaveholders responded to resistance with brutal punishments to deter further acts of rebellion. Punishments ranged from whipping and mutilation to execution, each designed to instill fear and maintain control. The harsh repercussions for resistance underscored the systemic violence embedded in the institution of slavery, making acts of defiance a courageous but perilous undertaking. Understanding the context of sexual exploitation, legal dehumanization, and resistance with its repercussions provides a comprehensive view of the multifaceted challenges faced by enslaved individuals during this dark period of history. It emphasizes the complexity of their experiences and the resilience required to confront and resist systemic oppression. Legacy and impact. Generational trauma. The legacy of slavery extends beyond the historical period, leaving a profound impact manifested in generational trauma. Enslaved individuals experienced extreme physical and psychological hardships, and this trauma was often passed down through generations. The systemic violence, family separation, and dehumanization imprinted lasting scars on the collective consciousness of descendants. The impact of this trauma is evident in various aspects of mental health, community dynamics, and societal perceptions, underscoring the enduring consequences of historical injustices. The trauma has influenced family structures, coping mechanisms, and interpersonal relationships, contributing to challenges in areas such as emotional well-being and identity formation. Understanding and addressing generational trauma is crucial for fostering healing and resilience within affected communities. Long-lasting social and economic disparities. Slavery laid the foundation for enduring social and economic disparities that persist today. The systematic denial of education, economic opportunities, and political agency to enslaved individuals and their descendants created a pervasive cycle of disadvantage. Even after the abolition of slavery, discriminatory practices, segregation, and institutional racism continue to hinder the progress of black communities. The economic disparities resulting from slavery are evident in areas such as wealth accumulation, employment opportunities, and access to quality education and healthcare. Redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and unequal opportunities further entrench these disparities, contributing to the existing wealth gap and social inequalities. Addressing these disparities requires acknowledging the historical context and dismantling systemic barriers that perpetuate inequality. It underscores the importance of reparative measures, social justice initiatives, and policies aimed at creating a more equitable and just society. It is crucial to approach discussions about the legacy and impact of slavery with sensitivity, recognizing the ongoing struggles faced by affected individuals and communities. By understanding the historical context and acknowledging the deep-rooted consequences, society can work towards fostering healing, promoting equity, and addressing the lasting impact of this dark chapter in history. In the echoes of history, the impact of slavery reverberates through time, etching scars on the descendants of those who suffered. Generational trauma endures, casting shadows on emotional well-being, identity, and community dynamics. The legacy of slavery persists in the form of enduring social and economic disparities, reflecting the deep-seated injustices that must be addressed. Approaching this history requires not just acknowledgement but a commitment to healing, justice, and equality. It demands a reckoning with the ongoing struggles faced by affected communities, a sensitivity that recognizes the resilience required to confront such systemic oppression. As we navigate the complexities of this dark chapter, may our shared humanity guide us towards fostering healing, promoting equity, and dismantling the lingering shadows of a painful past.